Welcome to the People Strategy Forum podcast. We're a show that guides leaders to elevate the overall workforce. We believe that people are at the heart of successful organizations, and each team member's well-being, their rewards, career development are essential to a happy and healthy workforce. And so this show discusses the practical and effective leadership strategies for top executives, senior professionals, and talent managers overall. So today we have a very special guest, Wendy Ryan, and I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. But before I get there, I just want to acknowledge our panel here with Howard Nisewitz and myself. Howard and I are with CompTeam, and we've been working together for quite some time. So it's always great to have Howard and his guidance. He's an expert in compensation and systems and HR overall. And so it's really been a pleasure to work with him.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, you bet, Howard. And so today we're going to be exploring the transformative power of leadership with none other than Wendy Ryan, the CEO of Kadabra. With a wealth of experience spanning over 2 decades, Wendy's not just an advisor to leadership, but she's an architect, a visionary that is redefined what it means to be a leader with her Learn, Lead, Lift framework. Her acclaimed book, Learn, Lead, Lift, How to Think, Act, and Inspire Your Way to Greatness is not just a manual for leadership, it's an invitation to elevate the human spirit in the workplace. So for those who are ready to be inspired and inspire others, let's create workplaces that are brimming with purpose and passion. That's what we love to do here at CompTeam through our compensation and talent management pieces. And we're so fortunate to be able to have real experts like Wendy join us and sharing knowledge with the rest of you. So welcome, Wendy, and thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I'm glad to be here this morning and glad to be here with Howard as well.
So Wendy, you know what, I'd really love to just dive into your history, your past, and how you got to start Kadabra, and what inspired you overall to write the book Learn, Lead, Lift.
Yeah, so my background is started out in human resources, and I still have a big piece of my heart there. And that really, for me, the journey was always about leadership and people, and has evolved through not just internal HR and being a generalist, but also to serving a lot of organizations from a consulting perspective. And that eventually led me into, excuse me, leadership development and organizational development, and kind of expanding from the individual, the team, the organization, being able to kind of go between each of those groupings is really fun and challenging for me. The book came about, I started writing in 2018, and it took me about 3 years. I think I've always been a writer. I've always been very good at it. So it came pretty naturally, but I was waiting for the right season of my life. I was waiting until I felt like I really had something to contribute. And so as I was nearing a milestone birthday, the big 5-0, I decided, okay, it's now or never. You probably have enough experience and have enough of a point of view now around leadership and people and organizations that you may have something valuable that would help others. So that was really the genesis. It was about, how do I synthesize all of the learning that I've had and create something that can be helpful to other people that are going to carry this work forward.
And so when you just think of the important work that you did with, just people strategies and HR and so forth, I mean, I know that you've been working with a lot of unique concepts and ideas and so forth. What are the major themes that have been driving your life over the past 5 years?
Oh, wow. Well, for me personally, it's definitely been a season of change. It's been that way, I think, for a lot of folks, in no small thanks to, big external events like the pandemic. But for me personally, my children in the last 5 years have moved from being, I have three, and they have all gone through the journey of middle school, high school, and or college. So we just this year became, my husband and I, empty nesters, so to speak. So it's a real season of change, both for the family, but also professionally. I also started angel investing um, alongside of my work in leadership development about 6 years ago. So that has really taken me to some interesting places and spaces in that time.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you as far as being a new empty nester. I have now 4 kids, and they've slowly been moving out of the house over time, and now I feel like, I'm all alone, so I can share that with you.
Yeah, it's both wonderful and also like, oh, now what? You know?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I find myself reaching out to them all the time. They're probably tired of hearing me like, "Oh, come on, leave me alone." Trying to be with my friends.
Yes.
Uh,
Although I've heard they come back. And in
yeah,
our
yeah.
case, I think that's definitely happening. So
And and grandchildren come along the way.
now I hear that's the best part, Howard. I hear the
It
grandkids
is.
are like the prize, for
Yeah.
all this work as parents.
Yes, it is fun. And
Oh, good.
you get to hand them back.
Yeah.
Good. I look forward to that.
So, Wendy, tell me about your book, the Learn, Lead, Lift Framework. I mean, who is this book really written for? What's the ideal person that should be reading this?
So I think it is certainly the book I wish that I had read when I got out of college and started my career journey. Um, but it's not just for those 22, 21, 20-year olds. So what I did is I started with this real curiosity about, well, what I think makes for a great leader. I have some ideas about that, but what do other people think? And I was really intrigued by the idea of asking people that maybe don't get asked that question typically in a corporate setting or in a university setting. So I took what I later came to understand is called a grounded theory approach. I have a master's degree, not a PhD, so my research career only went so far. And so I deliberately went out and, in the process of writing the book, did over 40 interviews, and they were with people who had a really wide variety of life experience, professional experience. So, for example, I interviewed 3 artists and I asked them, what do you think makes a great leader? Well, most people don't ask a painter that question. I asked athletes, I asked first responders, teachers, therapists, so sort of thought about what are all the people that might have a perspective on this that we could really learn from collectively. And what I found in doing that is that there were some really strong themes that came through no matter what people's individual experience had been. And so that combined with my own experience all sort of synthesized what became the Learn, Lead, Lift framework. And the essence of that is that great leadership is the synergy of 3 things. It's mindsets, which is how we think. It's skill sets, which is what we know or know how to do. So the analogy for that would be handheld tools, a hammer, a saw. Um, and then behaviors, which is how do we show up to others? So I might think that I'm great at emotional intelligence, which we identify as a skill set in the framework. But if you're not experiencing me that way, there's still a gap there. And so I think traditionally in leadership, we really leaned hard into things like our skills and into behaviors. We didn't really think about mindsets. That's sort of newer to the conversation. And I think what the framework does really well is it just puts all of that together in a way that is very relatable because the book is filled with stories. So in these interviews, you a lot of that comes through in the books. It's not just me talking about what Wendy Ryan thinks is great leadership. You're hearing from a lot of people, and it's a fun read, I think, as a result too.
I'm glad to hear that you talk about mindset and that's so important in this equation.
So important.
Yes, because it is kind of a new thing when we think about it, because and so critical, because you can have the right skills and behaviors and know how to do the job, know how to walk the process and have that proven experience. But if your head is not in the right place, if you are stuck in another world or phase where you shouldn't be, that's not meeting that objective, it holds you back. So have you tell us some experiences that you've had with leaders that are stuck in the wrong mindset?
Yeah. So I think that one of the first shifts that a leader really has to make and is just understanding that we actually can choose to think differently than we think today. A lot of us were not taught that growing up or in our education. It was, here's what to think, not an awareness of thinking as something that can be flexible and can adapt. So I think that in itself is really powerful. I think for most leaders, with that understanding in mind, where the struggle tends to be is understanding that I can have, for example, a growth mindset, which is believing that I can learn, I can improve, I can shift. I can have that in some contexts and then not in others. So I can have a great growth mindset when it comes to golf or when it comes to gardening, but I may not be bringing that to work with me. So the other, I think for leaders, a lot of times the stuckness we see, particularly in the workplace, is that people aren't situationally applying what they might be doing well in another setting. So some of it is looking for, where are you having success with these shifts in other domains in your life, and how do we bring that here? And a lot of us have been taught that, again, to really compartmentalize work, home, church, community, all these different domains in our lives. And sometimes that doesn't serve us very well, especially when we're trying to learn and grow. And the world is as volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous as it is.
Yeah, and no kidding. I mean, I think that's where, I mean, in my life, I know I've been stuck there before. When we think about how fast the world is changing now, that is true. That's truly change is the only constant, right?
Yeah,
If it's a true fact. I mean, and I think that in the past, people had the luxury, let's say it's a luxury of having a similar or mindset that is somewhat static, and they could leverage that expertise through their entire career. Uh,
right.
no more the case, right? Things can change, and we may not be aware of it. We constantly have to test ourselves to see, okay, is this still true? Is it still true in this environment? Is it still true with these people? With the way that in this situation that we're experiencing. So how do you work with managers to ensure that they have this awareness of constantly checking themselves and understanding, are their truths actually still relevant?
Yeah, that's a great, that's sort of the $1 million question, is how do we help people do that? And I can think of a lot of examples, and a lot of this type of work, for me, depends a lot on context too, right? So I really look at, if I'm working with a CEO, or if I'm working with a director, or someone who's in another type of leadership role. Because the other thing is, um, sort of a not so secret is, in Learn, Lead, Lift, we talk about the fact that, leadership, it doesn't just apply to someone with an official title. Parents are leaders, volunteers are leaders, so leadership is we have a definition for it, that it's really about influence. So sometimes we also have to understand there's the role, and then there's, who are you being as a leader in that role. So the examples that come to mind when we talk about this are For example, I worked with a C-level executive a few years ago, and we did a lot of work together around how he was showing up as a leader, because he had a very long tenured person at this company, had been absolutely instrumental in building a lot of the IT ERP infrastructure. So, and this was a retailer, so making that move into e-commerce was a big deal. And I remember at one point, he was trying on all these new behaviors, and then the company was encountering some headwinds, as businesses often do. And he attributed to those headwinds as now he's got to revert back to previous styles. So all these new behaviors that he'd been trying, that all the people around him were really experiencing as helpful and constructive, he sort of attribution error was said, well, since I started working with you, everything went to pot. So it's sort of a failure in a way. As a coach, you never want to hear, wow, we're really deliberate about do no harm, and we're not here to destroy value in a business. We're here to add value. But I thought it was interesting that he wasn't able to he wasn't able to understand that, how else can I choose to think about this? So he had a very fixed mindset about certain things, and he wasn't able to sort of do that level of complex thinking, even though he's brilliant, around multiple things can be true at the same time. And this is an instance of that. So what would be another explanation for why things are tough? How can I still show up, behaving in a way and being a leader that people really want to follow? What's the third way? So it's not easy, and some people are not ready for that work. And it doesn't mean they're bad people, but part of our job as coaches and consultants is recognizing that we can't control that.
Yeah, some of that's just a failure of human experience. When we kind of under stress, we go back to that comfort area.
Absolutely, we do. Yeah.
Leaders are under a lot of pressure, and a lot of times it takes root in financial pressure. I have to get revenue up. I have to, get production up. And while you want to accomplish all those things, that's not the end goal, right? You need your people on board. You need your people engaged. You got to have their hearts and their mind. And, so if you kind of like shift the focus a little bit and how do you leverage your people? How do you get your people excited about coming to work, doing the work, adding value?
Yes.
That's a big shift. And yet you have, like, say, if it's a public company, shareholders and all these other demands. So it's a lot to balance.
Absolutely. My dad was a public company CEO, and I remember dinner table conversations about, about shareholders knocking on the door, fights in the boardroom. And he shared a lot of things that in hindsight have been very informative for me in working with leaders. And it's not easy. It is a lot of pressure. I think from an investor perspective, what's interesting about this particular story too is when a leader makes themselves indispensable, or really believes that they're indispensable and doesn't nurture and develop that team, that's a huge risk and a liability for the business.
Right.
Because if that person, God forbid, has a heart attack and isn't there tomorrow, then what? So, all of that, whether we sort of want to grapple with that reality or not, all of that is something that we need to think about as leaders. It's not, I wouldn't call it selfish, but I think we need to be really mindful that it's not all about us too. We've got lots of other people that are impacted by our decisions of who we show up as, how we show up.
That's right. And, just a case in point in what's happened in the past 6 months, or it may be the past year, I guess you could say, is exactly what you're saying. As far as we've had, there was a revolution, I could say, in how we work, how we show up for work, remote work, flexibility. And then the economy, took a nosedive there, and companies were under stress. which caused a lot of CEOs to revert to previous behaviors, and
Yes.
I often equate it, it's like it's just like driving, right? So it's like when you're driving along, it's in a nice country road and looking at all the sights. And then suddenly you're like, okay, well, now there's an emergency. You start driving faster, that vision starts tightening up. You don't see things that are going on out here. And you just miss it. You miss it all. And so I'm glad that there's people like you, Wendy, that can pull leaders back on track to ensure that they can see the sights and still pay attention to what's important.
We
So
can only try.
yeah, we can
We
only
can
try,
only
that's for
try.
sure. But when we think about the book, I mean, we were just talking about how rapid changes, and I know your book's been out for a few years. What are the elements that you've witnessed have evolved since writing your book? And I know you're working on some other projects. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think there's, good news in the sense that since the book came out, I do think it has the staying power that I hoped it would have. I do think that the Learn, Lead, Live framework really gives us that blueprint for what does great leadership really look like now and for the next several decades. And I don't say that because I lead with ego. I say that because I want to lead with invitation. I want people to dig into the book and say, well, that's a bold statement. Why is that? And also to understand that we're always a work in progress. You're never done becoming a great leader. So it's not that you read the book, you pick this up, you read it. It's a pretty short and fast read, actually. It's simple to understand, but it's hard to do, and you have to keep doing it. So we're always in a process of becoming, and doing that work does pay off. So I think, well, although like the media and the stories we hear, we hear a lot of that. Yes, people need to come back into the office. Nobody's learning, what they need to learn. The young people are not being mentored, or people aren't working hard enough, or you hear all those things. It's I think it's an invitation not to react, but again to sit back and say, what do I not yet understand? What do I need to learn more about? We talk in the book about systems thinking as a mindset, which I talk about as the art of seeing around corners and beyond the known horizon. Like, we need to push our thinking out a little further, and I think that is really reinforced in the book. And I don't think it's sort of I don't think it's going to go away. So I don't know if I'm answering your question well, Sam, and I'm not trying to dodge it, but I don't really see anything that I look at now in the book and I go, wow, that's really out of date, or I'm worried that's going to be outdated in 3 years. I think the way in which we apply the framework and the concepts will continue to evolve. For example, AI, it's here. We're going to be integrating it into how we work. It's not going to be an option, in my view. So, much like at some point, it's hard to believe, I know for a lot of your listeners, but at some point there wasn't an internet. And at one point in my career, I worked for a company where we could send email, but only internally. And when I think back now, I go, wow, how did I ever do business? Like, how is this possible? It's going to be like that with AI. So that's going to change the way and the how, but the basic ideas around mindsets and skill sets and behaviors, they're not going to go away.
Yeah, it's so funny you bring about that as far as the past and seeing how we've evolved. I remember when I was a kid, I used to go into my father's office and he would be working on these. He was a CFO of a company early in his career, and he had these green pads with all the little checkers on it, and you'd be going through and working on this like a spreadsheet, which we have spreadsheets today. We just realized how far we've gone. I can't imagine if you
I
had
can't either.
write everything down and tally up the columns. Oh my gosh. So yeah. but we could share plenty of stories like that, but that would be a whole nother podcast for sure.
Wouldn't it? Yes.
Yeah. So I guess the big thing, though, as what you're talking about, as far as we were talking, I knew the answer. Your answer was going to be a framework. Is something that we can rely on and is proven that we can use going forward. Now, one thing that frameworks are great for is it gives us an infrastructure for decision making and so forth.
Right.
And that's something that we have to do on a daily basis as leaders, making that decision. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, there was the choice for a leader to put the blinders on and forget what's out here and start marching ahead. Now, as leaders, you have to think about, okay, well, I have to do what needs to be done in this emergency situation for the company to survive, my people to be taken care of, and so forth. But there's that choice of what do I sacrifice? And so I know that your system has a 3T model. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how leaders can use that for decision making?
Yes. So the 3T model is a mindset within the Learn, Lead, Live framework because it is a way of thinking. It's also something that's pretty easily translated into a tool. So one of the reasons that we really like it, and I think a lot of leaders, when they learn about it, really find it useful is because it's a mindset that's easy to operationalize that way. But the idea behind it, it was born quite honestly out of frustration. I had worked with a lot of leaders who were brilliant people that had lots and lots going for them, but could not make a decision. And the delay around making a decision was very detrimental to the organization. And so I kept scratching my head as a coach and a consultant going, why is this? And how do I help people shift this? So the 3T model was born out of that, as I think a lot of things are, right? A real world problem or situation. And then we say, how do we solve for this more generally? So the idea is that there are, in any given set of circumstances, we only have fundamentally 3 choices. We can choose to tolerate it, we can choose to transform it, or we can choose to transcend it. That's it. And I think the big aha for leaders who are sort of perpetually sitting on the fence around some important decisions is that by not making a decision, you are by default tolerating. And when you tolerate, what that means in terms of resources, what that means in terms of opportunity is that you are investing time, energy, resources in maintaining the status quo. And so unless the status quo is really what's best for the business and the organization, that is costing you. So I think a lot of times we sit on the fence because we think that, well, if I don't make a decision, then I'm not making the investment yet. I'm not spending the money. I'm not doing this. And I think the 3T helps remind us that actually you are, because it costs money. It's like a duck swimming on the pond. The feet have to move. The duck's going to sink. It won't just float there forever. So just in that one insight, I think the 3T can be very valuable. And then when we talk about the other T's, then it gets more around, are we really committed to investing in what it takes to change? Are we really willing to do that? Does that make sense? Or can we change ourselves enough that the current status quo doesn't really affect us the way it did? So it's both a way of thinking and a very practical model to accelerate decision making.
So I can see it this being super powerful, and it's also a thing that we need to. I think that we need to categorize or put some boundaries around as well, because what I've witnessed leaders doing over the past 10 years is they've been taking action like your model says, the 3T. They're either tolerating, transforming, or transcending. And so in a situation they may I've seen some leaders, they start with a decision and then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it gets beyond their core focus of the business. So how can we help leaders understand where they should start and where does this end? And thinking about some of these big issues. I mean, a lot of companies, they can't solve world hunger, but there's things that they can do very effectively. So how do we make that decision as a leader to understand where our boundaries are?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sam. I think how you're framing the problem, or what is the problem we're trying to solve for, is really critical on the front end. And so I think a really key purpose of leadership, whether that it's the CEO or it's the executive team collectively, or it's another group, um, it's orienting and reorienting. You know, it's saying, here's the vision, and here are the lanes, right? So that idea that you bring up around boundaries, I really see that as a function of leadership. And so we have to have that clarity as leaders. We have to be able to communicate that and keep communicating that. It's not a one-time thing. It has to continue going. Um, and a lot of times you're right, people can get kind of lost in what's possible. So you see this a lot with DE&I, for example. We see companies that said, well, and I worked with a lot of organizations who said, well, should we care about equity? Is that our job? Because our mission is XYZ. It's not to solve for systemic inequity, right? And so how do we sort of do our part and show up in a way that's consistent and mission aligned? Be aware of the context in which we're operating now, where this is a concern, but also not go so far out. So I think for me, as you were talking about that, I think DE&I is where it showed up most for me in working with organizations the past few years, helping say, how do we orient and reorient and keep doing that?
So if you wouldn't mind, if we could bring this 3T model to life a bit under this concept of DE&I, or systematic racism, so forth. So as a leader is making a decision and they're going to follow, they're either going to tolerate, transform, and transcend. What does each of these decision outcomes look like in that context?
Well, I hold the view that tolerating is not an option when it comes to addressing what we know are systemic issues. And whatever our belief system is around the how and the why, what I invite leaders to tune into is the fact that that is the experience that many people have, right, that are working for us, depending on how they identify. So rather than get hung up on sort of the how and the why, initially we have to just be at a place of saying, that is what a lot of people who hold different identities experience and believe. So we start there. So tolerating it, especially when we put ourselves in their shoes, is really not an acceptable option. It's probably not great for our brand, right? It's probably just not, however we want to couch that, it's probably not a good idea. At the same time, we really don't have the option of transcending, because transcending means I'm changing myself enough that this no longer affects me. The status quo has nothing to do with me. And so in DE&I terms, we have a term for that, and it's called bypassing. The analogy I would use is emotion, right? This applies there as well. If I'm feeling something strongly, if I'm really mad at my husband because he did something that I wish he didn't do, I can't just choose to transcend that. Emotion is something that has to be digested, has to be processed. It doesn't just, I wish it away and I release it. There's a process that has to go through. So similar here with when we're dealing with systemic oppression, we're dealing with systemic inequities, however we want to couch that. The bottom line is there are people who, by virtue of their identity, have historically been excluded from access to capital, from job opportunity, from promotion, from health services, a lot of things. So we don't get to do that. So really that kind of narrows our options to transforming. And so then as a leadership team, the question is, so what do we need to change about the status quo in terms of ourselves and how we do business that is going to be responsive in a mission aligned way and is taking into account all of our stakeholders to work through that. And that's a huge question. It's a big question. And it's why I do believe that organizations should invest and continue to invest in moving that forward. But it's going to be very context specific, and it's gonna, you have to do the work. There's no cookie cutter, apply this solution and it's going to work in every context. It's very sensitive. People don't enjoy talking about it. They get uncomfortable. So it's yeah, we have to be really committed, and we have to be in it as leaders for the long haul, because it takes a long time to shift culture, to shift mindset, to shift practices. Everything from going through your employee handbook and saying, are we using gender neutral language in there? Are we still talking about maternity leave and paternity leave instead of parental leave? Those are like very tiny things, but they send huge signals. And I know that with your work in engaging employees and the work experience, I'm sure you've seen that those little things can make a huge difference, but they take time. We can't do it all in a week.
That's right. And, one thing that I wanted to get your expertise on is you mentioned, we're talking about the 3T model, and as you pointed out, in this particular situation, we know that there's a right answer.
Yeah.
But then let's say you're a senior HR leader, you mentioned one of the most important things about being a leader is influence, right?
Yes.
And so you have your CEO, or let's say it's the board, and they're coming back and say, whoa, wait a minute, this is not our business model. This is not our problem to solve. And so what do we do to influence, to ensure that we're showing them the consequences of that action?
Yeah. So again, I think it really depends on the specific scenario and the context and the people in it. But I think that as senior HR leader, we do need to find out, how can I influence to the extent I can, right? And some of that we know is data. And there's a lot of great data out there that shows us both the pros and the cons, taking action, not taking action. So transforming, not transforming. What are the impacts on organizational success, whether we measure that financially or, market share or any of the other outcomes that we might care about. So that's one place that's always a go-to. I also think, again, coming back to the mission, particularly if it's an organization that is very mission driven, not for profit, government, certain and that exists in tech companies as well and other sectors, but those are the ones that come to mind first. That's really important to keep pulling through. I wonder can we wonder aloud together, if we don't do this, are we drifting? Do we have that drift? Those are kind of, to me, the starting points. And then it's, what are we working with? Who are the individuals we're trying to influence, and what's going to work with them?
Can you give some examples of when companies need to embrace the transcend journey?
Yeah, so to me, my favorite example of that is, and I think the easiest to understand it is, imagine a software team, right? And I've worked with software development groups before, and they are used to writing code and developing the software in a particular way and a particular timetable. And a lot of times that's sort of set. So if leadership comes to the software team and says, hey, we want this new feature, software team says, great, it's going to take 4 months, right? And then a lot of us that are not technical experts go, okay, that you tell me, okay, you're telling me 4 months, it's 4 months. Well, imagine a scenario where you need to accelerate that time frame. Leadership says, well, we've only got 2 months, or we're going to miss out on, securing this major customer. And this is what happens. So in that scenario, that transcending would mean, okay, well, the reason it's 4 months, the status quo is, we have this many people and we do it this way. Well, what if that software group instead, and the leader of that group said, okay, how else could we do this, right? Do we double the amount of people? Would that, compress the time? And this is actually based on a real scenario. Leadership says, no, you can't double people. We don't have the budget. So you have to do it in less time with the same amount of people you have. And so what I have seen is then that software leader goes, okay, then we have to change how we do this. We have to rethink this so that we aren't dependent on additional staff. Our process can actually change. And so they fundamentally shifted and changed the whole way they approached software development. And so that's an example of transcending. So the status quo, which the requirement was, you got this much time and you get this done, was fine.
So it requires a completely new way of thinking.
Yeah, it's changing yourself enough that the status quo doesn't bother you. Yeah. For example, at the simplest terms. Doesn't affect you the way it would.
Yeah. Well, this is hugely valuable, Wendy. So as we are pulling all this together, and we your book and the concepts within, and can you tell us what are the core things that our listeners should be thinking about now? What should they be taking away from this discussion?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really valuable for, if I'm in a senior HR leader in an organization, or I'm the CEO of a startup or a developing organization, what I want to say is that it always has to start with you, right? It starts with, why do I want to be a leader, and who am I being as a leader? Those are really two important questions that we need to answer. I'm not a CEO because it has to be something outside of, because I like this paycheck, right? It's beyond that, right? Beyond the sort of extrinsic rewards. Really, what do I want to be here? And why do I want to do this? Why do I want to influence other people? Why? And who am I being? And then what are the people around you that are leading alongside you or are looking to you for leadership? How would they answer that question? I think that's a really interesting starting point for an organization, is to do that exercise. Just say, why are we doing this? Why do we want to do this? And I think that clarity then leads us to, what are the resources and support we might want to engage to help us in that? It's really hard to become a great leader all by yourself. I will say that, particularly working on mindsets, you benefit a lot from engaging a thought partner. So whether you have the ability to hire a coach, for example, or not, we need that social support. We need that sounding board in the form of another human to help us see ourselves clearly. So once you feel like you have as much internal clarity as you can have, I think the next step is, I've got to validate this with someone else. And let me engage with someone else who can help me be who I want to be as a leader, whatever that looks like. So I don't think there's one magic bullet, but I do think we shouldn't try to just go it on our own and put that pressure on ourselves. I don't do it for myself. I have lots of other people I lean on that challenge me and help me and hold me accountable for being the leader that I want to be. And I think that's strength. That's not weakness.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. Tell me, what should leaders do next if they want to learn more? They want to learn more about you and from your book. What steps should they take?
Yeah, well, the book, we have a website for the book called learnleadlift.com. It's all one word. So that's a great place to go if you're curious about the book. If you want to pick up a copy, I encourage that. And then our website, which is wearekadabra with a K.com, is a great place to learn more about the work we do there. We provide learning solutions for corporate settings primarily, and all based on leadership development. There's a lot of free resources. There's a lot of thought leadership blogs, etc. there too, that you can learn. And if you enjoy what we're talking about, I think you'll come away with with more inspiration. If you want to connect with me, I always welcome that. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so that's a great way to connect me and let's have a conversation.
Perfect.
Great.
One last question. What are you excited about in this new year?
Yeah, I'm excited about a lot of things. I think personally, it's a year. I am the executive producer and a cast member for a film called Show Her the Money, which is about the funding disparity that exists for women. We're highlighting women VCs, which stands for venture capital, fund managers, female founders, and angel investors like myself. And I think that it's a very eye-opening. It's a very people learn a lot, people laugh, people cry. It's very inspirational, and so I'm really excited that we're taking that film on a 50-city tour and screening both in the U.S. and internationally. And that I think is going to, one, it's already generating a lot of conversations. It's generating a lot of checks being written, which is wonderful. So a lot of people getting funding that wouldn't otherwise have that access to capital. And I think it's really building a community of people who are saying, you know, we're leaving so much economic value on the table. How do we unlock this? And part of the answer to that is by making sure that we are investing in women, BIPOC, and LGBTQ founders. So I'm very excited about that and being part of that journey and building that community. It feels very aligned with my work in leadership and also just in business to kind of bring all that together in a new way.
I'm so glad you're doing that work, and I'm excited to see the film. So thank you for letting us know about that.
My pleasure.
Well, once again, Wendy, it's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our audience. I hope that people reach out and get a hold of you and make a difference in their leadership. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. Thanks, Sam. Great to see you.
Okay. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next week on the People Strategy Forum. Bye now.